Sadducees ask Jesus, in the resurrection, whose wife will the woman be? Reminds me of a time when I was canon at Christ Church Cathedral in Cincinnati, and I was with a group of friends who were trying to work out ways for the cathedral to engage with people who had complicated relationships with Christianity. You know, people who either had no experience with Christianity, were suspicious of Christianity, were intrigued by Jesus, but not sure about the church, or had been hurt or even abused by the church, that kind of thing. All kinds of people. And the leadership team would gather to plan events and worship and things like that with all these kinds of people in mind. And as part of that planning, we explored where the people in the leadership group were with their own faith and understanding of Christianity. And I remember, we talked about all kinds of stuff, and I remember once talking about the creeds, and specifically the line in the Apostles' Creed about the resurrection. I believe in the resurrection of the body. And one of the people in the leadership team asked, if we're raised in the body, everyone who ever lived, how will we all fit? I got to say, his question was not aggressive, but he also, my sense at least, was that he wasn't asking because he actually wanted to understand how. He could imagine the idea of the immortality of the soul, but not the resurrection of the body. He couldn't imagine how, as we hear in Job, in my flesh I shall see God, who I shall see on my side, and my eyes behold and not another. His question was not a bad faith question so much as his way of saying, this doesn't make sense. And maybe if we dig deeper, I think also it might have been an expression of his, and maybe all of our, fear of risking that kind of a serious hope. Do I risk hoping for that thing? Let me just settle for the immortality of the body. His question was not a bad faith question, but the Sadducees' question in today's gospel is a bad faith question. They don't really expect Jesus to give a satisfactory answer. As the gospel points out, they did not believe in the resurrection, but they weren't there to argue theology with Jesus. They wanted to make him look foolish. But they didn't want to make Jesus look foolish because they had a disagreement with him about a point of doctrine or theology. This is a far more serious disagreement. To understand what the Sadducees were really up to and what Jesus is saying in his answer, we have to understand the context a bit better and where the Sadducees and Jesus fit into that context. So the conversation takes place in Jerusalem. Jesus has ridden in on a donkey, the people spreading their cloaks along the road, and the multitudes praising God and saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." You might recognize that. It's what we celebrate on Palm Sunday. And he has cleansed the temple by driving out those who were selling things there, and then he has been teaching there. And the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people, Luke's gospel says, kept looking for a way to kill him. But they weren't quite sure how to do it because, Luke says, all the people were spellbound by what they heard. Why were all the people spellbound? For his entire ministry, Jesus had been preaching to working people like himself, fishermen and farmers and construction workers, to the poor, to the sick, to the broken, to the left out and rejected like tax collectors and prostitutes. And these all among a perennially oppressed people who in their distant past had been slaves in Egypt, and even after they'd settled in this land, the Promised Land, had come under the oppressive rule of one empire after another, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and who were now living under the rule of the occupying Roman Empire. with their legions marching in the streets of their towns and cities, with their swords and their tramping boots, harassing and terrorizing them, where soldiers could disappear, any one of them at any time, and creating a climate of fear and hopelessness. A people who were exploited by their own leaders, kings and priestly elites, and who longed with the longing of generations for liberation from all of these. In their midst, Jesus had come, casting out demons, healing the sick, raising the dead. And he had brought good news to the poor, and release to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, and the hope beyond hope, that the oppressed might finally go free. He was preaching, and not only preaching, he was demonstrating a radically new, abundant, and everlasting life in a radically new world of justice, peace, and love. He was bringing them, in his words and in his person, hope. Of course they were spellbound. Of course they were spellbound. But the Sadducees were among the priestly elite of the high priestly family of Zadok. That's where the word Sadducee comes from. They were managers of the temple with close ties to King Herod and other rich and powerful elites in Jerusalem. And through them, they had the approval of the emperor and Rome itself. They had status, power, wealth in this imperial system. And if the people were convinced that Jesus is really their liberating king and that there is a new kingdom of peace and justice and love coming, and the Sadducees' position and power then would be up for grabs. And make no mistake, the Sadducees had no intention of losing their position and their power. So in this question put to Jesus, the Sadducees were taking something simple and clear, what Jesus had been preaching all this time and showing them all this time, and mystifying it with unnecessary nuance and complication. Not to get to some complicated truth, but to exploit the human fear of risking hope, and in that way to maintain the status quo. In this question about marriage in the life of the resurrection put to Jesus, the Sadducees were not asking a good faith question at all. They were mocking him, essentially saying, "Don't be silly, Jesus. The whole idea of the resurrection and all that goes with it, the liberation from sickness and poverty and oppression and exploitation and injustice and death itself, makes no sense. It's impossible." In this question put to Jesus, the Sadducees were intentionally reducing something that was mysterious and wonderful and powerful and glorious in what Jesus was saying and doing, a hope for all people who live in fear, anxiety, and oppression, to something small and legalistic and mechanistic, in order to ridicule this rube Jesus, who claimed to be a great teacher and maybe more, but was really, everybody knew, just the son of a construction worker from Nazareth in Galilee, a region of fishers and farmers. And not just to ridicule Jesus and diminish his authority, but to ridicule hope itself. But Jesus knows two things they don't know. And something that maybe we, who are the body of Christ, Jesus' body, need to learn and relearn again and again. Because every time and every age, this side of God's kingdom has its version of Sadducees and its kings and its emperors with their legions mocking and terrorizing the vulnerable in our minds, in our hearts and souls, and in our streets. Jesus knows this, that the powers of this world behave this way, trying to trap those who bear good news and who proclaim and reveal hope for something more, when they feel most threatened, when they know on some level that time is short. And he knows this too. God and God's kingdom can be resisted for a time, and people with a vested interest in the way things are can tell us that what God has said and what we hope for isn't possible, and that God can't do what God has promised to do. And in that way, they can exploit the doubts of people like my friend in Cincinnati, who wanted to trust but just couldn't understand it, and who maybe feared to risk and hope. But ultimately, God will accomplish God's will for us and for all of creation, groaning under the power of suffering and violence and death. And God is the God of the living. For God, all are alive, Jesus says. And no matter how dark things get, even as dark as a crucifixion, no matter how hopeless things might seem, no matter how much the vulnerable may suffer now, nothing and no one, no elites, no rulers backed by violence or the threat of violence, not even death itself, has any real power over us. And nothing in this world, nothing, can limit God or reduce God's power to stop the coming of God's justice, God's liberation, God's healing, God's love. Nothing in this world, nothing, can stop the coming of God's kingdom.